Hi, everyone. This is William Thomas. I am part of the kinesiology faculty at Cal State Fullerton, where I teach exercise physiology and both the lecture and laboratory classes. I'm also the owner of Ergogenic Sports Nutrition and the current California State Elite Time Trial Champion, individual time trial champion. So, the purpose of today's lecture is to just basically inform everybody on the rationale and reasoning behind endurance, exercise, hydration, and nutrition. And the reason why I'm combining the two is from a performance aspect, you really need to attend to both rehydrating your body and feeding your body. If you don't do one properly versus the other, your performance will suffer. So another reason why I'm doing this lecture is because there's been some new product out there on the marketplace which really has no purpose other than to make money. And so when I see companies put out product like this just to make money, and I won't say it's snake oil, but I will say that it is certainly robbing you of your cash, that your cash could be spent in better places. So I'm going to tell you why and how you should focus your attention when it comes to hydration and nutrition. Before we get into the products themselves, we need to define our physiological targets. So in other words, the reason why we hydrate and feed during exercise. So the reason why we feed during exercise, and this could be in your sports drink, could be more solid food, but the reason why we ingest calories is to spare muscle glycogen. Muscle glycogen is going to be the preferential fuel for high intensity exercise performance. So anytime you need to make a race winning move, you're going to need muscle glycogen. So when you feed, your muscles essentially can use some of that, whether it's from your blood, well, it would be from your bloodstream. So whether that's glucose, amino acids, could be fatty acids, your body's going to have more access, your muscle's going to have more access if your bloodstream is high in those types of fuels. And therefore, that should spare some of the glycogen, which is the carbohydrate stored in your muscle. So feeding spares muscle glycogen. Now, it doesn't necessarily have to be all carbohydrate. It could contain a mixture of amino acids or fatty acids. But when you add in, for example, into your drinks or your food, when you add in lots of fat, that is going to impair digestion, or in other words, gastric emptying, to a point to where you're not going to be getting enough energy into your bloodstream, and that's going to make you more dependent on using muscle glycogen. So preferentially, our food sources, nutritional sources, will not have much, if any, fat in it. What they should contain is predominantly carbohydrate, and perhaps some amino acids. And why not just carbohydrate? It is a choice, but the beautiful thing about using amino acids is that they do not affect how quickly your, and I won't say all amino acids, but certainly the most used type, for example, the branched chain amino acids, when those are used in a fluid drink, sports drink, they do not affect gastric emptying. So they're not going to sit around in your stomach, and they're not going to limit the amount of energy that gets into your bloodstream. So the reason why this is important to use amino acids in conjunction with carbohydrates is because you can't actually saturate all of what are called carbohydrate transporters or sugar transporters in your body. So in other words, you can take a certain amount of carbohydrates, ingest a certain amount of carbohydrates, and then you're going to get to a physiological limit And if you take any more carbohydrates at that point, it will do you no good. So the way you get around this to get more energy in your body is to add in amino acids in addition to carbohydrate. So the reason why you don't see a lot of amino acids in a lot of sports drinks, you might find some with amino acids. Some manufacturers might put amino acids in there, but usually they're very small amounts, maybe a gram or 500 milligrams per bottle. The reason is carbohydrate is much cheaper, much cheaper. So in order to maintain profit margin, they will either use very little amino acids to pay lip service, basically, saying that we have it in there, or they won't use it at all. So ideally, if you want to maximize energy intake and spare muscle glycogen, you're going to want to have both carbohydrate saturating your body, your transport mechanisms essentially, and have amino acids. Okay, now let's define these carbohydrates first. So we have sugars. These can be monosaccharides or disaccharides, meaning either they're a single simple sugar molecule or have two single molecule sugars bonded together in terms of a disaccharide. Then we have longer chain carbohydrates, which are called complex carbohydrates. And then we have fiber. So I'm not going to talk about fiber because you don't want fiber. It's not, I don't want to say you don't want fiber, but you don't want fiber as your energy source during exercise because it's not very digestible, right? So we want that sugar to get into our blood and we want it in there fast. Okay. And I'll cover that more about that in a second. So let's move on to the second aspect, and that is rehydration. So why do we need to rehydrate? Because we sweat during exercise. And excessive sweating, excessive fluid loss, what does that do? That increases cardiovascular strain because your blood volume drops, right? It also by increasing cardiovascular strain or decreasing your blood volume, it also decreases what is called cardiac stroke volume. And by decreasing maximal cardiac stroke volume, your VO2 max will drop. So hydration is important in terms of maintaining blood volume and your VO2 max. But also your circulatory system acts as like a radiator in your car, right? With cooling lines in the radiator. So essentially, the more coolant in your radiator, the better able your car is to cool itself. Car engine, more coolant, which is a mixture of antifreeze and water, the better able your car is to cool itself. So more fluid, better in terms of managing heat, right? And during exercise, we're making lots of heat. So anytime you become significantly what is called hypohydrated, or you guys can use dehydrated if you want. For example, 2% of your body mass or more, that can cause problems with performance. It can also increase what's called thermal strain. That just means that your body is getting hot, and you may start to feel hotter, especially if you start to get up in the well above 100 degrees Fahrenheit as a core temperature. But yeah, so not only increasing cardiovascular strain, loss of stroke volume, VO2 max, but also thermal strain, increase of perceived discomfort, if you will, due to increased thermal strain. It is very important to stay hydrated, right? So combining both of these things is essential, hydration and nutrition, to maximizing performance. So let's review our carbohydrate sources and what are called exogenous carbohydrate sources. If you're not familiar with that word, that means that it's coming from outside your body. EXO, exo means outside. So we're talking about food, or we're talking about food sources. We're not talking about what's stored in your body. So let's talk about the monosaccharides. Glucose and fructose are the two that we need to be concerned about. And the reason why those two is because in research, it's been shown that using a combination of both glucose and fructose results in the highest amount of exogenous, what's called utilization or oxidation. So that means that your body will use more of what you're feeding it versus the stored muscle glycogen. All right. So, and that's the whole goal. Now, if we just use one type of carbohydrate, the transport mechanisms, in other words, and these mechanisms are essentially how you get carbohydrate into your bloodstream, can become saturated before we even get to supporting exogenous carbohydrate oxidation up to about 90 grams per hour. So if you were to just ingest glucose, it wouldn't support 90 grams per hour. If you were to just ingest fructose, it wouldn't either. You really need to make use of both glucose and fructose transport mechanisms to be able to increase your blood sugar to an extent to where your muscles can use more of it. Okay, so glucose and fructose are the two monosaccharides that we need to be concerned about. Anything over, now, why can't we just ingest, 1,000 calories of carbohydrates all at once? Okay. The more the merrier, right? The more carbohydrates we ingest, the less muscle glycogen we're going to burn. And the reason is, again, because these transport mechanisms can be oversaturated and you simply can't get enough carbohydrate into your bloodstream beyond a certain point. So really, if you want to maximize getting carbohydrate and sugars into your bloodstream so you can stave off depletion of muscle glycogen, it needs to be glucose and fructose or derivatives, which I will talk about in a second, and in amounts no greater than 90 grams per hour. Now, when I say 90 grams per hour, I don't mean everybody. I mean that these are for athletes that are used to ingesting large volumes of fluid, large volumes of food, and their guts can handle it. You may have heard of the term training your gut. That's what that means. You have to get used to it. You can't just go from, and I'll say this for the most part, for most people, you can't just go from never training before to your first day of training and ingest 90 grams of sugar per hour and expect to be okay. You're probably going to suffer from some GI issues, and you're more likely than not going to not be able to use all those carbohydrates. So it's something you kind of want to crawl, walk, and run with. Generally, people are good from about 60 grams of carbohydrate per hour, novices. And then training their gut to be able to tolerate more. But over 90 would be a rare circumstance. So 90 grams, that's about 360 calories per hour. All right, let's move on from simple sugars to other types of carbohydrate. Let's talk about complex carbohydrate, and then more specifically about some common sources of carbohydrate that we consume in our diets. So complex carbohydrates, the most utilized type of complex carbohydrate in sports drink is something that's called maltodextrin. Okay. And maltodextrin is essentially a bunch of glucose molecules bonded together. But it performs in your body very much like glucose, in that those bonds are readily broken apart, and so it digests really quickly. Now, you may be wondering why people or manufacturers are putting it in their drinks and not just use glucose. And there's really two reasons why. Number one, it essentially acts just like glucose in terms of raising your blood sugar, which is what we want. We want those sugars to get in your bloodstream really quickly. But the taste of it is much more muted. So it's not as sweet as glucose. And this is important because what some manufacturers have forgotten is that taste is very important in terms of promoting hydration. If you're sweating 2 liters of sweat per hour, you're going to want to replace most of that. Otherwise, you're going to suffer from performance loss sooner or later. Now, if you don't like your drink, drinking 2 liters per hour is not going to work. You're not going to want to do it. I've seen it. I've seen people who don't like their drink, athletes who don't like their drink, refuse to drink their drink. And by the way, this isn't my product. This is another product who I worked with to develop a new product. I won't mention names, but the athletes on this team during the Tour of California started just drinking water. They wouldn't drink this particular sports drink because it was just too sweet. So yeah, palatability, which I'll talk about in a second, and drinkability is extremely important. You can't just shove a bunch of carbohydrates in there and say, yeah, this is great. Look, on paper, we got 400 calories in here. This is great. We're going to maximize exogenous carbohydrate oxidation. We're going to minimize glycogen usage, right? Oh, not so fast. So there's a lot of other things to consider. So maltodextrin, in addition to being less sweet than glucose, also empties from your stomach faster than glucose in large amounts. Okay, so this is important because you can pack more calories in your drink, but let's be honest, not all just, it's not just amount of packing in calories. For example, you can eat a turkey leg during your exercise performance. A lot of calories, right? But by the time those nutrients make it into your bloodstream, it's too late. So maltodextrin has the benefit in that you can not only pack more calories into it, but it gets into your bloodstream almost identically as fast as glucose. Okay, that's a win-win situation. All right, now there's another carbohydrate out there that's starting to be promoted, and it is essentially a starch made from cornstarch. It's called highly branched cyclic dextrin, and it is a way to pack more calories into a drink. But here's the issue. Again, if you were to look at, if you guys are familiar with glycemic index and glycemic load, the glycemic index of highly branched cyclic dextrin is far lower than maltodextrin. So what that means is that even though you can pack more calories into a drink without it affecting gastric emptying, it takes a long time for your body to break that down and get into your bloodstream. Okay, so maltodextrin is really the winner here because it breaks down quickly. You can get a lot of it in terms of how much energy you get into your drink. It is not very sweet, so you're not going to want to necessarily drink water at the end of an exercise or a race because your mouth is saturated with sweetness. And yeah, it's very tolerable on your gut, right? So you guys, you do not want a low glycemic index. You do not want a starch. You don't want flour. You do not want a low glycemic carbohydrate. During exercise, your body is using blood glucose. Your blood sugar will not spike from drinking 80 calories of sugar at one time while your body is burning 150 calories, you can burn 150 calories in 15 minutes. All right, it's not going to happen. right? Your body is fighting to maintain blood sugar, all right? Drinking small amounts of sugar while you're exercising is not going to cause a sugar spike. Now, if you ingest carbohydrate a half hour before you start to exercise, you're going to have a sugar spike. You're not exercising. You see, during exercise, especially moderate to intense exercise, your metabolic rate increases so much. In some cases, up to 20 or more times over resting values, that drinking regular small amounts of sugar is not going to cause an insulin spike, is not going to limit your ability to burn fat, but it will help preserve muscle glycogen, and that's the goal. Right, so yeah, eating flour, starches, if somebody's saying that, eat this because it's a low glycemic during exercise, no. Small amounts of high glycemic, meaning they get into your bloodstream really quick and your muscles can use it. Sugars regularly. That's what you want. Now, another common type of carbohydrate, and when I say common, I mean really common, sucrose. You may have heard of it, right? Now, what sucrose is it's one fructose molecule bonded to a glucose molecule. Ideal, right? There we go. Glucose and fructose are what we want. And with sucrose, we get them both. Now, the only issue with sucrose is two small issues. Number one, it's sweet. It's sugar. It's sweet, right? And the other issue is that it's not an ideal ratio. An ideal ratio of glucose and fructose is not 1-to-1. And that's what sugar is, or sucrose is. It's 1-to-1. So the way we can have an ideal ratio is through the incorporation of more glucose and more preferentially maltodextrin, because it makes it so the solution, especially if it's got a lot of calories in it, right? The more sugar in there, more carbohydrates in there, the more sweeter it's going to get. The use of maltodextrin gives you more glucose molecules, and you can get to the ideal ratio by using that with sucrose. All right, so glycemic index and glycemic load, why it matters. Now, I kind of briefly talked about glycemic index, and why it's important is because it is literally saying that in reference to glucose, which they give 100 value, how fast your blood sugar rises. So the higher the glycemic index for a particular food, the faster your blood sugar will rise. Now, why glycemic load is important is because it takes into account serving sizes or the mass of the food. So certain foods that are high GI may not be particularly high GL. And carrots, for example, carrots are fairly moderate GI, but in terms of glycemic load, they're actually extremely low. So, and the reason why serving size matters, or the mass of what you're eating. You can just think of it this way, right? If you have table sugar, sucrose, if you have 1 packet of table sugar versus 10 packets of table sugar, they are essentially the same. Table sugar has the same glycemic, whether it's 10 packs or 1 pack. Table sugar has the same glycemic index. But does that have the same effect on your blood sugar? Absolutely not. 10 packets of table sugar will rise your blood glucose to a much larger level than 1 packet. So in reality, glycemic load, which takes into account both the glycemic index and the mass or serving size of the food, is what you want to look for. More of a sugar generally rises your bloodstream more, but you also have to think about how fast it digests, right? So, let me see. Oatmeal Oatmeal, lots of fiber, right? Carbohydrates, predominantly carbohydrates. Its effect on blood sugar is not very high. And the reason is because it's slow to digest, particularly if it's less cooked and less refined, right? So again, it's not just a matter of getting carbohydrates in your body, it's a matter of digestibility too. All right, so what else? Anything else on this slide I need to talk about? Yeah, so carrots, just to reiterate, carrots have a moderate GI, but a very low GL. And a carrot, therefore, is not an ideal choice for nutrition during exercise due to its very low GL. Okay, so you want a high GL and sugars. Maltodextrin is one of the highest GLs. And it is that and glucose are reference points. Okay, so this slide, palatability and why it matters. All right, and I kind of briefly touched about why drinkability matters. Because look at, you're not going to want to drink something if it doesn't taste good, if it's overly sweet, if it's too chalky. That's one of the things with highly branched cyclic dextrin is it's clumpy, it's chalky. So it's just not a matter of how much calories you can stuff into something. You really got to consider drinkability too, how it affects your stomach. One of the things with using fructose or too much fructose is it can cause gastrointestinal problems. So the bottom line is, in looking at the slide, what works in the lab isn't always the best choice. Okay. Fluid texture, chalkiness, grittiness, sweetness, overly sweet, bland, GI tolerability, which ties into fructose. It's a reason why I like to use sucrose, because most people have prodigious amounts of sucrose and are very used to it. It's very easy on their gut. Their body's used to it. Maybe not so much in terms of fructose. So fructose can be a gut irritant. So if glucose and fructose are ideal, let's use sucrose because it's got a fructose molecule as a disaccharide, and it's easy on the gut, right? Other thing is fructose is the sweetest of all sugars. Fructose is the sweetest. So, you put 20 grams of fructose into a drink versus 20 grams of maltodextrin or 20 grams of sucrose, the fructose is going to be way sweeter. Again, drinkability, it matters. Okay. And so the combination, what I like to use in my products, I like to use maltodextrin to moderate the sweetness, to get a lot of carbohydrates into your system, easy on the stomach, and sucrose for really the same reasons. So we can get as much of the preferred sugars into your body that support maximal carbohydrate oxidation, glucose and fructose. We get those from maltodextrin. We get those from sucrose for the highest blood sugar support. Okay. If you have too much fructose, too much glucose or dextrose versus maltodextrin, your drink can be too sweet. Okay. Now let's think about this, right? If you have 2 grams of glucose and 2 grams of fructose in a liter of water, it's not going to be overly sweet. But then what is that going to buy you in terms of maximizing exogenous carbohydrate oxidation and glycogen sparing? Not much, because it's not a lot of carbohydrate. So the whole thing is, how much carbohydrate can we get into your blood, how fast and how much we can get into your blood while being palatable and not overly sweet. If we put in 200 grams of fructose or glucose into a liter of water, you will spit it out. Lots of energy. Going to maximize those transport mechanisms, glucose and fructose transport mechanisms, get a lot of carbohydrate in your body, but you won't drink it. Okay, so there's a method. You got to consider all factors. It's not just getting this or that into your drink, and and maximizing the amount of energy into your drink. You have to take into account palatability. You have to take into account um, uh, exogenous carbohydrate support. All right. And that calls for using the right amounts, ratios, and types of sugars. Okay, so just to reiterate, how much can we handle? How much carbohydrate can we handle? So, untrained guts, research suggests untrained guts can handle about 30 to 60 grams of carbohydrate, the right type of carbohydrate per hour. Trained guts can handle up to about 90 grams. And that's when you're going to really start to peak out in terms of how much exogenous carbohydrate support you can get in your body. Any more than that will do you no good. Okay, it will not increase the sparing of muscle glycogen. Okay, finally, 80 to 90 grams per hour is only supported by a proper ratio of maltodextrin or glucose and fructose or sucrose, because sucrose has a fructose molecule in it, but not highly branched cyclic dextrin or other complex carbohydrates due to slower digestibility and therefore blood sugar support. Okay, lower GI, lower GL, more importantly, is not what you want. So finally we get to hydration. And there's only one slide on here, but it kind of ties everything together. Here's the deal. You cannot separate the fact that increased carbohydrate requirements also increase fluid replacement requirements. Just think about that. What type of exercise is going to threaten muscle glycogen? High intensity exercise. So when we need to be concerned about taking in lots of carbohydrate is when we're exercising very intensely, or if it's for a very long period of time. But both of these factors, exercise intensity and duration, exacerbate the need for fluid replacement. And it is very common for athletes to lose more than a liter of sweat per hour. I've even seen over 2 liters of sweat per hour. So when you have these high energy drink manufacturers putting 400 calories, which is supposed to maximize exogenous carbohydrate oxidation, sparing muscle glycogen, but they're putting it in 8 ounces of fluid, it is completely inadequate from a fluid replacement perspective. You will dehydrate to the point of being hypohydrated and losing performance before your glycogen levels become compromised because of decreased cardiac stroke volume, decreased VO2 max, and increased thermal strain and perception of discomfort. So, what type of drink do we need that satisfies both hydration and nutrition? Number 1, it needs to be the right type, amount, and ratio of carbohydrates. Number 2, it needs to be in enough fluid that minimizes sweat loss. Number 3, it needs to be palatable. It needs to taste good and promote drinkability. There's no reason to have some optimal performance sports drink, theoretically optimal, or in the lab, it just looks really good on paper, but then somebody drinks it and spits it out. It needs to hit all of those parameters. All right, you guys. So I hope you've enjoyed this little lecture. What I want you to take home from this is not so much who to buy from, but I want you to take home from this is that you, in terms of exercise performance, high intensity, long duration exercise performance, you cannot separate hydration from nutrition. You can't say that I'm just going to meet all the energy requirements and I'll be fine. You can't say that I'm just going to meet the hydration requirements and I'll be fine. Otherwise, we just drink water, maybe with a little electrolytes in it. You have to target both. You have to have the appropriate amount of carbohydrates, the right type of carbohydrates, in the right ratio, in the right volume of fluid. It has to taste good to promote drinkability. Nobody's going to want to be drinking 1.5 liters of fluid per hour if it doesn't taste good. Okay? So I hope you enjoyed this review on exercise, hydration, and nutrition. If you have any questions, please feel free to either contact me on Facebook or my Instagram account, or you can contact me at Ergogenic Sports Nutrition. Hope you have a wonderful day.